Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where we invite you to join us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. Simple as that. You'll be with us here in the studio. 1 week from today, we will be talking to you at this time from Chicago, and what will be day one of the Democratic National Committee, the convention, of course, for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And we're going to talk more about that, what role Joe Biden will play on this night a week from now, and what role protesters will play. There's some pretty interesting reporting out there showing that tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters could be in Chicago, even with the change at the top of the ticket. And with that change, we're waking up again today to new questions about Kamala Harris's agenda. We don't have much of one, a skeleton of an agenda, if not what we saw in the Biden administration. And it's interesting as well to see the agenda form on the Trump side. What kind of a world are we in here where J.D. Vance is promoting expanding the child tax credit and Kamala Harris is parroting Donald Trump on ending taxes on tips? So that's where we're going to start here. This is the one thing we can hold our hands on right here, with a couple of exceptions. You know, Kamala Harris already said that she would support an independent Fed and so forth, but this is specific. When I'm president, we will continue our fight for working families of America, including to raise the minimum wage, there's one, and eliminate taxes on tips for service and hospitality workers, there's two. Donald Trump, by the way, says, hey, wait a minute, that was my idea. He rolled it out in June, and at that time we talked to Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, who had crunched numbers on this, finding that ending taxes on tips would add a couple of $100 million, if not more, to the deficit. He's with us right now to talk about this. I should say billion, by the way. Live on Bloomberg Radio, Marc Goldwein. It's great to have you from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Did your eyes roll when you heard about this one from Kamala Harris? Now, both presidential candidates are calling for this.
I mean, the tit for tat here is amazing. You know, it just seems like Joe Biden wants a child tax credit, so now J.D. Vance wants a bigger child tax credit. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump says no taxes on tips, so Kamala Harris says no taxes on tips. Who's going to pay for all of this?
That's what I'm going to ask you now, because if there isn't a plan to offset that, it would result in about $200 billion in deficit spending based on your calculations, right?
That's right. We think the Harris plan, and they've given us some more details, including that it's income tax only, but we think that Harris' plan to exempt tips from taxes and raise the minimum wage would cost between $100 and $200 billion. That's real money. And if there's not a plan to pay for it, it's going straight to the credit card. Okay.
If you put that together with the other one here, the expanded child tax credit, J.D. Vance is suddenly promoting this, and I'm not sure he talked to the boss about this one because Republicans have been pushing back pretty hard on Capitol Hill with every time the Biden administration proposed doing this. What would that also mean for deficit spending?
Right. So the current child tax credit is $2,000. Some Democrats have been talking about raising it to $3,000, even $3,600 in some cases. Vice Presidential candidate Vance has now said $5,000. That $5,000, depending on design, that could be another $2 to $3 trillion over the next decade. That, again, that makes our $200 billion look small, even though $200 billion is already massive.
This is incredible. So without a way to pay for these, we add to the deficit no matter who we elect, and therefore potentially increase inflation while we're at it. Am I right?
Yeah, you know, one of the ironies is the idea of the child tax credit is to help children. But how much are you really helping children if you're burdening them with all this new debt? Who is going to pay this back? It's going to be higher taxes on future generations.
Spending time with Marc Goldwein at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. The knock on the Harris campaign, Marc, has been no real agenda, no real details. What does the committee want to hear?
Well, it's only been a few weeks, so I'm looking forward to the convention and hoping that we'll get some more details there. But what we want to do is have a full plan from Donald Trump and a full plan from Kamala Harris, and then we will score those plans. That's what we've done in every other election. And so far, we're not there in this one.
Well, give us a sense of what she's required to tell us, what it is that we're actually asking about here. You want a tax proposal, I'm sure, more broadly than taxes on tips or a child tax credit. You want her to weigh in on the 2017 Trump tax cuts that are set to expire in the term of whomever becomes president next. What else do you want to know? What should we be listening for?
Yeah, so I want to know her agenda, but what I especially want to know is her solutions. As you mentioned, we have tons of tax cuts expiring at the end of 2025. I want to know what she's going to do about them. And I want to know what Donald Trump is going to do about them. We have 3 major trust funds, Highway, Medicare, Social Security, all hurtling towards insolvency. I want to know how she's going to address that. We have a debt limit that's about to come back, and we need to raise it. We have discretionary spending caps that are going to expire. I want to know how she's going to solve all these problems. I also want to know what she's going to do about our massive debt and interest payments. Interest costs this year will be larger than Medicare, larger than defense, our second largest government program. That's just not sustainable. And I want to hear how President Trump and how Vice President Harris are going to turn that around.
Well, we're going to want to hear from you when we learn more, Marc. It's great to see you. And thank you for the reality check as ever. Marc Goldwein, Senior Vice President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. Just coming off of this interview with Joe Biden, a lot of folks are wondering what it is he might say a week from tonight at the Democratic National Convention. It's clearly going to be a passing of the baton, the torch, whatever cliche you want to reach for. He did talk about it with CBS News. The headline on the terminal, Biden says he dropped out due to risk he'd be a distraction. Interesting. Listen to the president speaking with Bob Costa on CBS.
The polls we had showed that it was a neck-and-neck race. Would have been down to the wire. But what happened was a number of my Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate thought that I was going to hurt them in the races. And I was concerned if I stayed in the race, that would be the topic. You'd be interviewing me about why did Nancy Pelosi say, why did so, and I thought it'd be a real distraction.
A distraction. The president of the United States, a distraction from his own election. Of course, he was looking down ballot, I presume, when he said that. And it's one of the many things I want to talk about with Kevin Walling. It's been way too long since he's been with us. Democratic strategist, former surrogate, of course, for Joe Biden in the 2020 race. He's back on it now with Kamala Harris. Kevin Walling, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to see you. I want to ask you about the convention. I've got a lot of things that I want to talk to you about, Kevin. But of all the people we're going to talk to and hear from today on Bloomberg, I will venture to say that you know Joe Biden more than any of them. And I wonder your thoughts on this as he's trying to go through the motions, trying to emotionally, of course, to deal with this decision that he's now billing himself as a distraction. What did you make of that?
Yeah, Joe, good to be back and good to be with you. I think you're seeing the president in real time still processing some of the emotions with regards to his decision not to seek re-election. He took some time off this weekend gathering with family. You're right to point out just a week from today, it's going to be actually kind of the Joe Biden night at the convention in Chicago. So there'll be a number of tributes to the president. He will obviously have a speaking role on Monday night and kind of kick off the convention. And to your point, pass the baton to his number 2, to his running mate. And in that conversation he had on CBS, he talked about being, a transitional president, a transitional leader, something that he talked about early on in his term, then wanted to run for re-election, and then through a discernment process realized that Donald Trump to him is an existential crisis to this country. And we've seen, just in this past couple of weeks with the rollout with the Harris-Walz ticket that, they're best positioned to take on the former president.
When he says, I thought it would be a real distraction, you can almost hear Nancy Pelosi in that remark, Kevin. And I wonder if that just underscores the idea that it was not so much his own election he was thinking about. It was all the House races, all the members, all the Democratic frontliners who were looking at him, asking for him to step aside.
Yeah, the president at the end of the day is a team player and cares deeply about his legacy. He knows, if the House and the Senate were to become totally in Republican control and the former president to come back, most of his legacy would be washed away with the Republicans in control. So this is a guy, 40 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president, 4 years as president, who served with any number of these individuals, both in the House and the Senate, and I think really cares deeply about the bench and making sure that Democrats not just win the presidency, but are successful down ticket in a way that's contrasting with the former president, who really seemingly only cares about his own election and not being the best kind of surrogate for down ballot races.
Well, take us to Chicago, Kevin. We're all going to be there together. DNC. A lot of questions about the form this is going to take. I'll ask you about the element of protesters in a minute. There's some troubling reporting on that this morning. But Joe Biden's going to open this convention. That's going to be the sort of passing of the baton, maybe literally on the stage in front of the delegates in Chicago. How high should our expectations be for Kamala Harris to outline a detailed agenda by the time we leave Chicago?
Yeah, I think she's certainly going to, and that's what the convention is all about. Not just in terms of, putting our two front folks front and center in terms of, making it issues of character and experience, but also laying out a vision. And you're starting to see the vice president talk about key aspects of her agenda, right? So she talked about lowering the cost of prescription drugs, in addition to all the drugs that they've done over the last 3.5 years with the Biden administration, making housing more affordable. You brought up, Joe, in the outset, taking a line from Donald Trump in terms of taxes on tipped workers in Nevada that she previewed before that crowd of 12,000 folks. So look, we got to not forget that she just became the nominee officially just last week, and will continue, I think, to roll out each of these policy prescriptions. She also talked about some of her positions on the border and immigration in that speech outside Phoenix last week as well. Teasing some of the elements of that, signing on to that bipartisan border bill that we had that reformed asylum laws and things like that. So as this process goes forward, she's going to outline a lot more of her policy prescriptions, and certainly that will be on display in Chicago.
Well, I wonder how worried you are about this event being interrupted, Kevin. There is reporting this morning that just because there's a change at the top of the ticket, Joe Biden is not going to be the nominee. Pro-Palestinian protesters will be out in force. In fact, large numbers next week, tens of thousands, is what the Washington Post reports, creating scenes of fury and dissent. It says, in a moment when Democrats will be working to project unity, a coalition of Muslim and Arab American grassroots groups based in the Midwest have sent a letter to Kamala Harris outlining what it would take to win back their votes, including a plank in the party platform calling for a permanent ceasefire. Kevin, they're not going to get that. So what are these protests going to look like?
Well, as we saw, the vice president handle protest in Michigan last week, kind of when they were trying to shout her down. I think she pretty effectively managed that situation. She was the first, senior administration official to call for a ceasefire. Got some grief from different aspects of my party being so outspoken on that front. So as she said in that event in Michigan, I don't know why you're protesting me. Go after Donald Trump that wants to bring back a Muslim ban, for example, that would never sign on to a ceasefire, who stands lockstep with Bibi in terms of the current situation on the ground in Gaza. So, we'll see these protests. Chicago is obviously set for that. I think, in conversations with the convention team, they continue to extend the perimeter of that with an eye towards security. These people have every right, obviously, to express frustration. But, as the vice president said, focus your frustration on where the actual issues are. And you'll see that she's much more lockstep in terms of calling for the ceasefire and trying to work and bring an end to the Hamas-Israel war than we've seen, from the other side.
Kevin, I have to ask you before you leave us, as a capital D Democrat, what went through your mind when you heard J.D. Vance make the rounds on Sunday morning calling for an expanded child tax credit?
Yeah, listen, I love, I'm a Catholic, so, I believe in converts. So we're happy to have, J.D. Vance, touting our line. I'll note that his voting record doesn't line up for what he's actually calling for. I think he actually missed the vote to extend that child tax credit serving in the Senate. So, words speak, less louder than actions here. But certainly, if you're looking for a pro-family party, that's the Democratic Party. It ain't these attacks on IVF and other things that JD is trafficking in.
Well, it's interesting. JD Vance, he likes Lena Khan. He wants a higher minimum wage and an expanded child tax credit. Maybe he should talk to Kamala Harris about getting those done.
we're happy to have them on board.
It's just, maybe nothing matters. Kevin, it's good to see you. I'll meet you in a week, okay, in Chicago. Thanks for being back with us, as always. Democratic strategist, former Biden surrogate in 20.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Here in New York at World Headquarters, yes, indeed, the fastest show in politics is on the road here. Kailey will join us about 20 minutes here in the studio as well as we carry on our conversation on a campaign that is going to bring its focus to X tonight. We just got another post. I say tonight. Apparently this is an all-day affair. Donald Trump posted on what most people still call Twitter for the first time in about a year, a short time ago, to talk about the campaign. He posted a campaign video, whatever. But we just got a new one now. It's an image. It looks like kind of a wrestling promo or something. Donald J. Trump and Elon Musk live on X. Remember the big interview tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern. He writes, enjoy, just one word, enjoy, exclamation point. And we probably will. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis are taking the phone off the hook starting at 8 o'clock tonight. We do wonder how well this is going to work, knowing how these have gone before. This is a Twitter Spaces or an X Spaces thing like Elon Musk did with Ron DeSantis. Now, we've got a whole pile of polls to go through, and I want to hear from the panel on that. But since we just got this drop, Jeanne Zaino, I know, is excited. Bloomberg Politics contributor, political science professor, Iona University. Rick Davis, partner, Stone Court Capital, also Bloomberg Politics contributors. Happy Monday. Great to see both of you here. Jeanne, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. What is going to happen on X? Is Donald Trump going to endorse EVs or something? How does this go tonight?
I think it could be anything. They're going to be hoping, to your point, that they don't have a repeat of what happened to poor Ron DeSantis when he did this. But, I think this is an indication that we've seen actually for the last few weeks that the campaign really feels like if they can target this small group of under 50 men who don't get their news from traditional news organizations. They're described sometimes as low information voters, gamers, and others, that people like he went and talked last week with Aiden Ross, that these will be the people who can put him over the edge in this campaign. And they are very narrowly focused on this group. So we've had them upset about the Rogan endorsement of RFK, which he took back, the Aiden Ross interview, and now tonight, Elon Musk. I think it's just a continuation of where they feel they can pick up this support and start to turn this thing around where they've had a bad few weeks now.
Rick, I don't know your thoughts on this as a campaign tool, but let's be honest, an endorsement by Elon Musk is a pretty big deal. This is one of the most famous people on the planet. Does he bring too much baggage for it to help?
Well, he does divide the room. I mean, there's no question that there's a lot of dissent in amongst the world, domestic politically, around Elon Musk. He puts himself out there. He's sort of veered toward the right all year long. He's been a topic of scorn and also inspiration to hundreds of thousands of people. He's even claimed he's going to deliver just under 1 million votes for Donald Trump. That's powerful stuff, and he's got the financial means to do it. The question is, who does he turn off in the process? I mean, sure, politics is addition and subtraction. So in addition to trying to target these voters that Jeanne was just talking about, what are you losing in the process? Because these are tough acts to follow, literally. Suburban women, goodbye to the Republican Party again for another cycle. Wow. They've found somebody else that can speak their language. And then how deep does it go? How far out in the exurbs do you get, losing votes while gaining them in the rural areas?
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of important polls out. They dropped over the weekend. They don't all agree, and I'm curious to get both of your impressions on them because we spent the last 2 weeks talking about a honeymoon, and now we can put numbers on some of these. We had the Bloomberg swing state poll, showed them statistically tied in the 7 swing states. Now Siena is out with its swing state poll. Harris at 50% to Trump at 46%. among likely voters. That's important, not just registered. These are likely voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, we can talk all day long about the headline numbers, but there's something specific here, and Jeanne, I'll start with you, that argues with what we're seeing in the new FT poll. The Financial Times worked with the University of Michigan Ross School. Also, it's in Kamala Harris's favor on the headline. But they found as well that there's disagreement among voters on who to trust when it comes to the economy. The Econ poll on the FT looks good. The Siena poll, however, finds that voters still prefer Donald Trump when it comes to whom they trust to handle the economy as well as immigration. Jeanne, how are you dissecting all of these numbers?
Yeah, it was difficult to make sense of the FT poll in conjunction with what we've seen throughout the campaign and, of course, the latest New York Times Siena poll. And on the issue of the economy overall throughout this campaign, pre-Harris and now post-Harris, the Republicans and Donald Trump have had a strong advantage. So I would not suggest that she has turned that around. This may be an indication that the numbers are moving in her direction, that she is doing better on the economy. She is not as tied to Joe Biden's economic record in the mind of likely voters as as he was specifically responsible for. So numbers may be moving in her direction, but I think it's really premature to say she is winning certainly on this economic numbers. The reality is those issues, economy and immigration, favor the Republicans and Donald Trump. The problem is he doesn't have the discipline to talk about those. And that's where the rub is. I mean, we even heard that in the Wall Street Journal editorial the other day. Can he be disciplined enough to talk about these issues which favor him still? If he continues with these sort of meltdown diatribes on Truth Social X and on these rallies about everything except issues, then he is going to lose this middle of the road that he needs in some of these swing states on these issues. And that's maybe what could be driving down his numbers there, or probably more to the point, driving up her numbers.
Rick, before the weekend, most of the polls showed, and remarkable in its own right, Kamala Harris essentially tying up this race, statistical tie, making up for the gap that Joe Biden was showing in the polls. Do you believe these new numbers showing her actually taking a lead in such a small period of time?
I don't get hung up on the actual number. I see these as directional signals, and she's got some pretty good directional signals, and they're all pointing up. And literally, ever since Donald Trump's speech at the Republican convention, his directional signals, polling-wise, have been pointing down. So this is where the Democrats want to be going into their convention. This is a fully scripted event in about a week. So the assumption is they'll punch through even more positives than they have today, maybe get a bump in the convention, which means you're rolling into Labor Day with those directional signals pointing up for the Democrats, a critical period of time to start that campaign. You have to count this as a toss of a coin election right now. And I would say on the economy, what was interesting about that Financial Times poll that I read was that 60% of the people polled thought that Kamala Harris needed to take a different direction than Joe Biden's economic policy. And what you're probably seeing is this idea that Kamala Harris is people are writing what they want on her right now. They don't really know much about her in the sense of, specific metrics on issues. So they're willing to give her a chance, right? And I think her speech at the Democratic convention, which will be the next time tens of millions of people see and hear her, is going to be her opportunity to either make that good for them. In other words, be able to appeal to the broadest section of America she can, or start to take people off of that list of folks who kind of are sitting on her ballot right now wondering who she's all about.
Really interesting, Rick, because Kamala Harris says this week she will roll out a more comprehensive economic agenda. So presumably, Jeanne, we're going to get that before the convention. There'll be a lot of reporting on it over the weekend going into day one on Monday. And that's when we're really going to learn how fragile this lead is, because we're adding actual policy positions to her candidacy. But the other side of this convention, Jeanne, could be a very difficult one when it comes to protests. The Washington Post today reporting tens of thousands are still expected, even without Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. In fact, a coalition of activists, Muslim and Arab American groups based in the Midwest, have sent a letter to the vice president outlining what it would take to win back their votes. They include demands that are clearly not going to be met, like changing the party platform to call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. What are we in for? You're going to be there. We'll all be there a week from today. How much will these protesters change the DNC?
Obviously, they're not going to get that on the platform for the DNC. I think this is a test for the DNC and for the Harris campaign, and quite frankly, Harris herself. How does she manage this? I think she really does have to speak her truth to these protesters and say where she stands on this issue. We saw her do a little bit of that after her meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. I think we're going to see her do more of that. And I think we're going to see her resort to the argument she made the other day at the rally when they interrupted her, which was, if you want to elect Donald Trump, then go ahead, because he is even further against the positions they're at than she is. So she is going to, I think, keep with those messages, but it certainly will be a test. And I think Democrats have to hope this isn't a repeat of 1968. There's no suggestion at this point there will be, but this is where they're at and they have to be ready. And to Rick's point, this is a scripted event, so they should have this under control in the venue. It's going to be outside where we hear a lot more about this.
Yeah, we'll meet you there. Rick, what would you advise the candidate to do in this case? Do you take the hard line? Do you continue to say, no, let me talk? If you want to fix this problem, I'm your only hope because Donald Trump will make it worse? Or does she invite them into the room, have a sit down, try to welcome them to the party? What would be your approach?
Well, you kind of hope a lot of that is that sort of sitting down is happening now, right? You want to preempt this as much as you can. And then if they show up, they show up. But right now, I would think it's smart on her part to have some leaders from her team, sitting down with these groups. And, they want to argue, they want to make a case. That's great. Just do it peacefully. Do it in assigned locations. Don't, harass delegates. Don't harass the media. Get it as contained as you possibly can. And then don't give it much brook. I mean, honestly, the performance that you want reported is on the inside, not the outside of that convention hall. And if they make it interesting enough, they'll get their share of eyeballs. And the reality is, I think that the student protests at the end of the last semester really wore out the American public, right? There wasn't a whole lot of kind words for these folks who held up people's graduations, tore up school buildings, and made a mockery of a lot of the rules and regulations governing speech at these famous universities. So I don't think there's a lot of goodwill for them going into this thing. They're very vulnerable to having this backfire on their movement, and I would think that they should consider that before basically trying to disrupt a Democratic convention that, as we've all been saying, makes no sense if you look at the politics. Who's more likely to bring a ceasefire to the Middle East, Donald Trump or the Biden administration? Look, we could even see a ceasefire between now and the Democratic convention. So all of this could even change. But again, I mean, you got to be positive if you're the Democrats and run your own convention. Well,
that's a great point. A lot of things could change, including this expected retaliatory strike against Israel by Iran. There is reporting on that as well, as Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, orders the USS Georgia guided missile submarine to the Middle East, speeding up the Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier, to get to the area, with a strike still expected this week. That could be the backdrop of the convention that we're talking about starting a week from today. By the way, the big Donald Trump-Elon interview tonight, shares of DJT down 5%. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
No matter where we are, Joe, we've obviously been tracking carefully all of the headlines coming out of the Middle East, as Israel is still awaiting retaliation from Iran for the killing of 2 leaders of Iranian proxies. And then, of course, there's also the questions around ceasefire talks, which allies would like to see happen later on this week. We just got a statement out from the National Security Council here in the U.S. that says President Biden today spoke with France, Germany, Italy, and the U.K. to discuss the situation in the Middle East and ongoing efforts to de-escalate tensions and reach ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza.
Important update here, Kailey. This is ahead of talks starting on Thursday. Is the idea that everyone, at least so far, we think might be at the table. Hamas has been suggesting it will not have a representative there. But how you have this at the same time as this impending retaliation from Iran is remarkable. That has not gone away. Reports today suggest that this is still in the works and could in fact happen within days, Kailey. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin now ordering more assets into the region. The USS Georgia, that's a guided missile submarine. We've also got the Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Strike Group said to be speeding up its voyage to the area. The end of this week is going to be remarkable, and that's going to be the backdrop for our convention in Chicago next week. When I say we, we're all going, and it's going to be quite a conversation that we have at that point. So before we get to the stalwart, do you know Joe Weisenthal's coming in here? This is one of the benefits
I
of
heard
being
a
in New York.
rumor.
He sends one tweet, and then we'll have this is going to be the most listeners we've ever had. Nick Wadhams is with us in Washington right now, of course, leading our national security team with the headlines on Israel and Iran. Nick, it's great to have you. Are we going to see possibly both of these happen this week, a ceasefire and a retaliation?
Well, that is definitely the question everybody wants an answer to. I mean, I think these two things are actually linked in the sense that the Biden administration and allies are hoping to get more momentum around the idea of a ceasefire, in part to try to head off that Iranian attack. So the idea being that if they can show Iran and others, look, there is a credible possibility that we could get this thing buttoned up by the 15th when there's supposed to be a new round of talks for the ceasefire, that may in some ways deter or shape the Iranian response. If you can basically make the argument, hey, listen, an Iranian response and an attack on Israel will scuttle the chances for the ceasefire. So obviously Iran feels that it's compelled to attack Israel, though Israel has not taken credit for the killing of a senior Hamas leader in Tehran. But these two things are very much connected. We're all waiting to see what happens next.
Well, and the question I have listening to you, Nick, is the other party that needs to agree to the ceasefire is Hamas, which is an Iranian proxy. So if Iran doesn't want the ceasefire to be agreed to so that they can retaliate against Israel, why would Hamas say, okay, we're on board, here's your hostages?
Well, I mean, it's a great question because we're always trying to figure out who exactly has the influence and to what degree Iran is actually shaping this thing. I think it's just also the death of Ismail Haniyeh a couple of weeks ago really upended the whole power structure. I mean, one thing we really have not been able to get to the bottom of anyhow is how much either side really wants to have this ceasefire, because their goals, as we've talked about so many times before, seem to be so opposite. Hamas wants Israel out of Gaza for good. Israel wants Hamas no longer to exist. So it's very unclear where you find an actual resolution when the two sides' demands are so opposite. But I think what you're seeing here really is a sense that what the U.S. and allies want is, listen, let's just pause the fighting, get this thing to stop for a little bit, try to ease some of the pressure out of the situation, avoid the escalation into a bigger war, and then we can figure out what happens next. So many big challenges over the long term, but in the short term, what you really are seeing is let's just get the guns to be silent for the time being, then kick the can down the road a little bit.
Nick, we have to ask you about Ukraine while you're with us just in our last moment here. Massive evacuations in the Kursk region of Russia as, of course, Ukraine continues this incursion across the border. Vladimir Putin is sending reinforcements. What is this going to turn into? Are they, in fact, moving the border in the process?
Well, I mean, a lot of questions about the Ukrainian motivation here, but obviously, if they are able to hold, to occupy, and then crucially to hold that Russian land, that's not something that they're going to be able to do for a very, very long time, presumably, given the number of forces they actually have, but whether that would be some sort of a bargaining chip when you do start thinking down the line about the possibility of negotiations, a little bit of like, hey, you took some of our land, now look at us, we've got some of yours. It gives Ukraine a little bit of leverage, a little bit of something to trade. Obviously, a big shock for Vladimir Putin, makes him look very, very bad. Looks like he's not totally in control. Certainly something that gives a little bit of an advantage to the Ukrainians.
All right, Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage in Washington, thank you so much. As always, obviously, President Biden keeping himself apprised with this phone call today of what's happening in the Middle East, surely what's happening with Ukraine and Russia as well. But, Joe, he's also gearing up for later this week to actually appear beside his vice president, now Democratic nominee, on Thursday in Maryland to talk specifically about the economy and bringing costs down for people. This is something we're hearing Harris talk more and more about.
I guess a preview of Monday. He's going to be speaking the first night of the convention, Kailey. This will be the first time we see them together, though, on a stage. Even as they've been both talking around this incredible change that we've seen. He sat down with CBS News over the weekend. Joe Biden suggesting he left because he was becoming a distraction, presumably down ballot. And she has been asked about Fed independence, whether she would continue the line of independence that we heard and saw, of course, from Joe Biden every time we talk to Jared Bernstein. We joke about it. Or be like Donald Trump, who would like to be basically setting interest rates himself.
Yeah, well, he said that at Mar-a-Lago. He thinks the president should have a role in setting monetary policy. He had just said that at the end of last week. Obviously, the vice president thinks differently about this. And someone who's thinking always differently or not is Joe Weisenthal, who is here with us in New York. He's co-host of Bloomberg's Odd Lots podcast, also the stalwart on X.
Came all the way here from the other side of the room.
We can't get you on the show unless we come to New York.
I'll come down sometime.
No,
if
I'm here, even
standing
from here
invitation.
All right, I will call anytime you want me to call in. But I'm thrilled to be here.
It's so cool.
IRL with you guys.
Well,
what do we talk about? Fed independence.
Well, we were talking about this in our morning editorial meeting. Does the voter care about Fed independence, or is it just us sitting in this room here at Bloomberg and listening to Odd Lots?
There are many Fed independence voters, even on Wall Street. I mean, I'll say a couple of things about this. One is that, there is a widespread consensus internationally among economists that economies benefit when there is an entity that is not directly politically sensitive, that the Fed chair doesn't have to stand for re-election, etc. There is a view that, counter-cyclical monetary policy is good, particularly when inflation gets too high. I mean, you see this. Look, right? So right now we're at a period where inflation has come down a lot. But, the talking point that both of you mentioned is the idea of cutting taxes on tipped workers right now. Now, economists would say when the economy is doing really well, that is not a good time to cut taxes. That's an accelerant. It's the exact opposite. But no one wants to talk about that, or no one wants to do that. That's difficult politically to do. There was the comment that I believe Trump also made about ending taxes on Social Security, which is essentially another, it's a tax cut. It's more spending, et cetera. Again, probably not the type of thing you'd necessarily want to do when the inflation is as high as it's been. All that being said, Trump had some decent instincts about monetary policy. Many people would say he was right, particularly in 2018, 2019, during some of the tightening cycle. And in fact, Powell himself had to walk back some of the cuts prior to COVID. So, there is a sense in which Donald Trump seems to have some pretty good instincts about where the economy is, what's necessary at the time. But fundamentally changing, who has a say in interest rate setting, I think many people consider it to be a fairly radical idea.
He's sitting down with Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Tonight. Did you see that's like a wrestling ad that they put up?
Yeah. So he's been gone. Last year he tweeted his photo of the mugshot.
Yes.
But he's been disappeared from Twitter for so long.
About
it's
a year.
Kind of amazing. He's
DJT stock is down 5% now.
Yeah.
That's an earth shaker.
It is.
Joe Weisenthal.
Because that's like the one thing that Truth Social had going for it was that they had the
that's the one guy.
On Trump posts.
So what are we in for here? Are you compelled by this sort of pairing of personalities? Is there policy here? Does the Elon Musk endorsement mean a lot to somebody? Who cares about it?
We'll see. I mean, look, both Trump and Musk have their sort of cults of personality, so to speak, and they obviously dovetail ideologically on a lot of things. You know, it's an interesting choice. Is it a vote getter or a dial mover? You know what I will say, though? There is something about Twitter specifically that I believe is very influential in the media. And it's the sense that, like, reporters, and I'm guilty of this myself, like, we see stories, things that people talk about on Twitter more than any other platform become things that we write articles about or do podcasts about, etc. And there's no escaping that fact. So I don't think, like, Twitter itself is a medium that, like, changes votes, but Twitter itself, I do honestly believe, changes what the media will cover. And so therefore, I think if you want to influence reporters, which I think is important for both candidates, if you want to influence reporters, it makes a lot of sense to be active on Twitter.
So we're still calling it Twitter, to be clear.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. What happened? I'm just old school. What happens on X?
This is the one day I was trying to call it X too, and now everyone's all right. Fine,
you know what's funny is I think during Trump's trial in Manhattan last year, Trump's legal team objected to a juror who still called it Twitter, which I thought was really interesting, and they were probably right to, because I feel like the sort of like Elon Musk fans, like they were really quick to like switch from Twitter to X, whereas the old school people were like, no, we're going to keep calling it Twitter. So when that potential juror said, no, I still call it Twitter, the Trump lawyers were like, no, he's out.
Well, I also am curious. I think we all remember what happened when Ron DeSantis launched his presidential campaign over Spaces, and it was super glitchy and just technically
is still ringing in my ears.
Didn't go very well. And I noted Elon Musk tweeted last night. X posted.
No, that's the problem.
I know. The verb still feels like tweet. But he said he's doing scaling tests ahead of this thing because they could potentially break the system again.
No, true. And that was a disaster because then they had other folks, like the VC David Sachs was on that call and he was getting interrupted. Like, probably the worst way to introduce your campaign imaginable.
That's saying a lot on the platform.
That's right.
Spent a lot of money on. Who cares about this election right now in the financial world? Because we keep hearing analysts tell us that nobody pays attention till we come back from the beach and the kids go to school. But I feel like, Joe, people are paying closer attention than ever earlier.
Well, what I would say is it felt like nobody was paying attention at all to the election until the debate. And I feel like the debate marked basically day one of this election. You know, it's a really good question because if you take Trump's at his word seriously about what he wants to do, there's some pretty big implications for the economy. I'm thinking particularly on tariff policy, specifically, which he takes seriously. It's one of the things that in the 2016 race, he talked about tariffs, and he kept his promise. You know, politicians don't always keep their promises. He did introduce new tariffs. He believes in it.
Joe Biden kept his promise, too.
But if you look at, like, the market, does it look like we're about to like enter some major escalation of a trade war? I don't really see it.
Nope.
So, you know, one of the questions seems to be is like, well, why isn't the market more anxious about, you know, I'm not even saying bad or good. I'm just saying potential changes. There's still kind of hard. It's hard to see the fingerprints on the election so far. You know, at this point in 2016, everyone was like, in the 2016 cycle, it's like we were all watching the Mexican peso, right? And like when Trump's polls would go up and the peso would go down, et cetera. It's not obvious to me looking at this market that there's like some clear Trump trade that has emerged.
Well, that's just because everybody's trying to figure out if the Fed's going to cut by 25
that's
or 50 next month, right?
That's
Which is why the
that's
inflation data is so important. This
and everyone's looking at the short term and the what is happening with the state of the labor market. But there's not some clear basket of stocks or something that seems to be directly like toggling related to what happens in this election, at least as far as I've seen.
Well, that's honest. What do we get after this thing tonight? He endorses EVs.
Yeah.
And does Elon
Trump
Musk work with the UAW or something? Does he? He's going to complain about the unions. That's why he hasn't been invited to the White House.
It's so right. It's really funny. I don't know. There was a comment because Trump made a comment in his speech recently saying, "Oh, he likes EVs. He owns an EV, and in part because Elon Musk endorsed it." It's so refreshing to hear a politician talk like that in some way because we're not really supposed to like
to be honest. You mean?
Yeah, you're not really supposed to say like, well, this person endorsed me, so now I'm going to say good things about their product or their industry, etc. We know that Trump has been really critical of electrification. He's talked about all the problems it's going to cause, and he's talked about, well, if we have electric trucks, then they're not going to be able to, the weight that bridges can stand is not going to be enough for them. Some interesting points. It'll be interesting to hear if EVs specifically come up.
Amazing. He landed the plane just like that. I thought with podcasts, you just
He's
talk.
got some practice.
There's no out time ever, like we have
Nailed
on
it.
Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Kailey, we should talk more about what's happening in Israel right now. Of course, we have the potential at this moment for a ceasefire with Hamas this week. We also have the potential for a new war between Israel and Iran, or at least a retaliatory strike. Joe Biden was talking about it in that CBS interview we discussed, in which he referred to himself as a distraction. That's why he left the presidential race. He also talked about the chances of a ceasefire emerging in Israel. Here's what he said.
The plan I put together, endorsed by the G7, endorsed by the UN Security Council, et cetera, is still viable. And I'm working literally every single day to, and my whole team, to see to it that it doesn't escalate into a regional war. But it easily can.
So it easily could escalate, and that's the other complicating factor in this, Joe, that yes, they want to achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which is a proxy of Iran, and yet the threat of Iran is still very much hanging over Israel. As an Israeli military spokesperson just delivered a televised statement moments ago saying that they are at the highest state of alert. So for more on this, we bring in now Natasha Hall. She is senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Natasha, we're really on watch for two things this week that theoretically, at least to me, would seem that they would counteract each other, or they contradict each other to a certain extent. Reaching a ceasefire agreement, which would be cooperation between Israel and Hamas, at the same time that Hamas, which is a proxy for Iran, is potentially going to take part, or at least could, in an Iranian retaliation against Israel. What are you actually expecting will go down in the coming days?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that's a perfect way to put it. It's essentially a checkmate at the moment between Iran and Israel. As you had mentioned earlier, Israel had assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who is the top sort of Hamas negotiator within Tehran, in a very highly secure IRGC building. This was a huge humiliation for Iran. And they felt like they probably would have to respond in some way. At the same time, you see a new Iranian government taking shape, which could be delaying sort of a response towards Israel. And you also have these ceasefire negotiations, which are supposed to be jump-started this Thursday. And many of the negotiators have said this is the final step. This is it. There won't be any more real efforts. You don't know what that means, but Iran is in a very difficult situation. They know that any kind of retaliation would likely attract a much larger Israeli retaliation. And at the same time, they also know that it could blow up the ceasefire negotiations.
What does it tell you, Natasha, when you see the news that we're seeing at the Pentagon here, the Secretary of Defense surging the guided missile submarine USS Georgia and the aircraft carrier strike group Abraham Lincoln into the area? What is the Pentagon bracing for?
Yeah, I mean, we see aircraft and warships and even a submarine heading into the region. I think a lot of this could be also posturing, making it known that the United States will be there if there is any regional escalation, and hoping to sort of check it before it begins with that predominant posture in the region. That said, it will be there if it needs to be used. But I think that what they're hoping to do is to signal something to Iran and to Israel, I think, that regional escalation should not be in the cards at this point, at this very, very tenuous point of ceasefire negotiations.
Well, and considering at the parties in those negotiations are not just Israel and Hamas, it is also the U.S. and Egypt and Qatar, and these are the allies who have been pushing for these talks to take place this coming Thursday. What role are they playing here, and how do you expect the diplomatic back channels between these countries and others in Tehran or elsewhere are working right now?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the really fascinating part. You actually saw the Jordanian foreign minister go to Tehran for the first time. A high-level diplomat from Jordan has gone to Iran in about 20 years to really try to take the pulse, I think, of the Iranian regime. You saw this unprecedented joint statement from Qatar and Egypt and the United States on Friday, really imploring the warring parties to take these ceasefire negotiations seriously and get it done. So you have a lot of other players here. And that could be who Iran goes to for their response, these other players like the Houthis, to try to demonstrate some kind of plausible deniability for a military retaliation on Israel. And that could be what U.S. forces, the U.S. Defense Department is bracing for at the moment, because it remains to be seen where that response will come from. And so it makes sense to have this sort of overwhelming presence in the region at the moment.
Natasha, there was a strike, an Israeli strike on Saturday in Gaza against a school, killed nearly 100 Palestinians, and the IDF says there were Hamas fighters operating in that school. But this is just yet another example of why so many people have been upset about what's happening here, calling for restraint, calling for the protection of Palestinian civilians. This is one of the deadliest bombings that we've seen in this 10-month conflict. Is it just part of the day-to-day headline now, or could this in fact jeopardize a ceasefire from being reached this week?
I mean, unfortunately, it wasn't a new incident. We'd seen schools that are being used as essentially displacement camps being bombed about 5 times in just the past few weeks. This one was particularly devastating, probably killed around 100 people. There were about 6,000 people that were sheltering in this school mosque compound that had been told to evacuate from other areas by Israeli forces. So I think it just shows the sort of the lack of clarity on how serious warring parties, including Israel, are about ceasefire negotiations and really the way forward. Because at the end of the day, if Israel still sees the elimination of Hamas as the end goal, it remains to be seen how you can get these ceasefire negotiations done with that very same group. And that's why all of these various attacks are so devastating for Palestinians and for their future as well.
All right, Natasha, it's always great to have you here on Balance of Power. We really appreciate your time as we are all on watch for what happens Thursday or potentially even sooner. Natasha Hall of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she is a senior fellow with the Middle East program. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.